Qatari official says Israel and Hamas are close to a ceasefire agreement, saying, quote, "Today we are at the closest point to reaching an agreement compared to previous attempts in past months." In a statement, a Hamas official said the talks are in their final stages. Both President-elect Trump and President Biden say a deal could be reached within days. For more on the latest, we want to bring in Hagar, Chemali, former US Treasury Spokesperson for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, and former Director for Syria and Lebanon at the NSC, also host of Oh My World on YouTube. Thank you so much for being here with us, Hagar. I'm curious from your perspective here, if we do see countries continuing to kind of seek alternatives to fuels as we do to fuel alternatives as we see more sanctions, more broadly speaking, specifically about what we've seen recently coming out of Russia here, what could that mean for oil prices moving forward?
Well, the oil markets are certainly going to react, and they're going to react to any of these movements that you're seeing, as you've always had with sanctions. I worked in sanctions for a very long time at the Treasury Department, and every time that we ramped up sanctions, whether it be against Iran or Russia or other areas where you have sanctions, like Venezuela, for example, where you have oil, you always saw the market react, but then it would calm down again. We have to remember, but the goal of these sanctions are really to target Russia specifically and its ability not only to finance its war machine, but to evade those sanctions. And that's what the recent sanctions are targeting. They're targeting these tankers that were working around existing Russia sanctions. And not only were those tankers working to evade sanctions, international sanctions, not just US sanctions, but they are mainly used by China and India. And so this effort is also to squeeze China and India and force them to find alternatives, primarily from the Middle East. So inevitably, obviously, with that, any analysis from that is that you're going to have an increase in prices, at least for a short term, but I can't say in the long term how it'll even out in the end.
Hagar, how effective do you think the sanctions will be?
Well, I expect them to be effective. What's not easily seen in the public eye is how these sanctions really do undermine Putin's ability to finance his war machine. Remember that sanctions are just one prong of a broader foreign policy strategy, and their only goal is to make it harder, costlier, and riskier for Putin to pursue his war in Ukraine. And in that regard, over the last 2 years, over the course of these sanctions, you've had numerous thousands of pieces of equipment, of Russian equipment, tanks and other and planes and so on, that have not been able to be repaired, that are grounded because they're unable to buy the parts or get the parts, and that is due to sanctions. So sanctions, as a rule, they aren't a silver bullet. They don't work overnight. They work over time. So they are expected every time Russia finds a workaround, and that's what these sanctions were about. Every time Russia finds a workaround, it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole. You've got the US and Europe on the other end whacking that mole. And so I do expect them to hit them. Will this bring an end to the war? No. This is about further increasing pressure on Putin while simultaneously helping Ukraine before Trump takes office.
Well, let's talk about that. What are you anticipating for the oil market under the next 4 years under the Trump administration?
Well, it's hard to speculate because President Trump-elect Trump is going to be is quite unpredictable as a leader in general. I will tell you that his proposed tariffs on Canada, should he go through with them, I have no doubt that would increase the price of oil, certainly in the United States, given how much oil we receive from Canada, that we buy from Canada. But that said, President-elect Trump postures a lot. So I don't mean to say he's not going to go through with some of his tariffs, particularly on China. I absolutely expect him to go through with the tariffs on China. But other announcements of tariffs sometimes are really about posturing for negotiations to prepare the United States to be in a good position for negotiations on trade or whatever it might be, or the border or migrants. I mean, whatever it might be that he's trying to do. That said, if he goes through with these tariffs, I see an inevitable increase in oil prices, but I can't say how it'll go over the course of 4 years just because it's such a long time period.
Hagar, from the insiders that you've been talking to, I guess, what is the reception or expectation of a second Trump presidency and just beyond tariffs, just how you see a second Trump presidency really reshaping or shaping the geopolitical landscape?
Sure. So you have a lot of things happening that are almost inconsistent. When people ask me, do you think the world will be safer? with Trump in office? My answer is yes and no, as it would be, by the way, for many presidents. And I say that, by the way, with no partisan agenda whatsoever. For example, I have a lot of hope for the Middle East, a hope that I haven't had in a long time, and that's maybe in part how President-elect Trump is expected to approach Iran. Specifically, Iran is at the root of most of the Middle East's problems. Iran is behind the Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, Assad, who's now fallen. All the recent dynamics you've seen in the Middle East very recently is really in large part because of Israel's efforts against Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. All of them are on the defense. All of them are weak, decapitated, or decimated in some shape or form, Hamas in particular. And then that led to Assad's fall, which not only that shifting geopolitical dynamic is not just about that, quote, axis of resistance. It means that countries like Lebanon can actually pull out of the impasse that they've been in for 2 years and move forward. It means that Israel has more opportunity to make deals with the Gulf. So I see a lot of opportunity in the Middle East in particular. And with China, I also expect President-elect Trump's behavior toward China to tame its expansionist policies in the South China Sea and efforts vis-a-vis Taiwan and Hong Kong and so on. However, when you're talking about Ukraine, and you're forcing, if he goes through with ending the war there the way he wants to, and Russia comes out with land, well, the problem with that is that you might have an end of the war, but that only gives Putin time to resupply, rearm, rebuild his military, and he'll only be incentivized to go after another country or more of Ukraine. And that really undermines the international order that's been set up since World War II. So there are going to be these pros and cons here. When I think about the tariffs, though, if he goes through with that, again, while I know that he's posturing for negotiations, I can only see inflation coming from those tariffs and a possible devaluing of the dollar. And that's personally what I'm most concerned with.
Hagar Chemali, great insight. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us here this morning. We appreciate it.
Thanks.